As recent disturbing reports about Donald Trump's questionable mental fitness continue to roll in, a journalist who interviewed Trump multiple times since leaving the White House has dropped a few bombshells of his own, and a CNN analyst actually calls out the mainstream media for their double standards regarding evaluating President Biden and Trump. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video, but I want to start with 3 clips from Raman Satuda, who is a journalist who's interviewed Donald Trump like 6 times since Trump left the White House, many times, and a guy who's writing a book about him. He had a couple of bombshells to drop about Donald Trump's mental fitness or lack thereof. We're going to play the clips and unpack them together.
Your biggest takeaways from sitting down with him, right after he left the White House, when his political power is probably the lowest it's been since 2015, and how he reflected on when he was hosting The Apprentice. And, the ratings were soaring in that first season, and just kind of what that looked like for him.
He was very deflated. He was conflicted. He was angry about the way in which the press had treated him. He still believed that he won the election. And he was happiest when he talked to me about hosting The Apprentice. It was the thing that brought him the most joy. We watched clips of the show together. We watched the theme song, and he really lit up. He watched his firing of Omarosa. And then he would talk about what he did at the White House, and he would become gloomy and resentful and unhappy and refer to Afghanistan and Joe Biden. But he also seemed to think that he still had some foreign policy powers. And there was one day where he told me he needed to go upstairs to deal with Afghanistan, even though he clearly didn't.
He told you that while you were interviewing him at Trump Tower, he told you he needed to go upstairs to deal with Afghanistan?
With the, quote, the Afghanistan is how he referred to it.
It's a remarkable experience. It's a remarkable book.
And again, there's more where that came from, but I do want to talk about this for a minute. So a couple of things. Omarosa, of course, is the former Trump again, celebrity apprentice wannabe, who also recently came back in the news for verifying that Donald Trump did indeed say the N-word. That was another Trump scandal, and there's a tape about it, and we talked about it in a previous video. But given all the stuff surrounding Trump at the moment, it tends to be, overwhelmed. But yes, Donald Trump did indeed say the N-word, and there's a tape about it, and Omarosa confirmed it. Also interesting that Donald Trump struggles with linear time. So even though he's no longer the president, he thinks that he has to get on the horn to weigh in on the situation in Afghanistan, presumably referring to the withdrawal of Afghanistan. Now, as a reminder, because President Biden gets a lot of flack for that, the execution of that withdrawal, Donald Trump was the one who set the terms for it. He was the one who inked the deal with the Taliban, the Doha Agreement. It was Trump who retrograded U.S. forces down to 2,500 troops and left President Biden with a commitment to get out of Afghanistan, despite the Taliban having 75 to 80,000 insurgent troops. The country was rapidly collapsing because Trump cut the Afghan government out of negotiations. He left President Biden a mess. But of course, Donald Trump doesn't want you to remember that part. But I just feel that that's worthwhile, that's important to address, given that Trump apparently at one point was preoccupied about Afghanistan. Maybe he should have helped set up the withdrawal under better terms instead of handing Biden a no-win situation. Another clip from Raman Satuda.
Can we just first start off about your sit-downs with Trump? 6 times after he left the White House, which, is such a different period, thinking about what's happening in Virginia tonight and seeing his grip on the Republican Party. What was he like? What did you observe from him when you sat down with him?
So I interviewed Donald Trump more than any other journalist since he's left the White House. We started in May 2021, and that report you just talked about meandering and confusing is right. He goes from one story to the next. He struggles with the chronology of events. He seems very upset that he wasn't respected by certain celebrities in the White House, and then he'd go to a story about The Apprentice. So as you know, Caitlin, it's very challenging to interview Donald Trump and to go toe-to-toe with him, but there was some cognitive questions about where he was and what he was thinking, and he would from time to time become confused.
Because you wrote at one point about Joan Rivers, him telling you that she voted for him in 2016, I believe, even though...
He confidently told me and declared that Joan Rivers voted for him when he ran for president, and Joan Rivers died in 2014. Joan Rivers died in 2014, so she would not have been able to vote for Donald Trump.
Unless, of course, dead people are voting for Republicans. Every accusation is a confession. They say that dead people vote for Democrats. Perhaps it's Republicans who are getting dead people to vote for them. Joan Rivers, of course, being a famous insult comedian and comic, and she died in 2014, 2 years before she would have had the opportunity to not vote for Donald Trump and instead vote for Secretary Clinton. But again, so what they're talking about in the context of this, they reference meandering. Again, we did a video about this, but Donald Trump recently met with a bunch of Trump-friendly CEOs who really want to back the guy. And then they told CNBC, a pro-Trump business news outlet, that they're actually less pro-Trump after having met with him recently because they question his mental fitness, because he's meandering, he's incoherent, he can't hold a single thought, he has ridiculous policy proposals. And in a media ecosystem that paid equal attention, or at least held the candidates to the same standard of mental fitness, this would have been devastating for Trump. And we'll see how it turns out. But again, corroboration from Raman Satuda, who, again, has interviewed Donald Trump more often since he left the White House than any other. Another clip to just drive the point home.
The other thing that I think is really interesting, because I really got to know Donald Trump post-presidency, and I got to see what he was like. And over the weekend, he was talking about how Joe Biden needs to take a cognitive test. Joe Biden, isn't all there. Donald Trump had severe memory issues. As the journalist who spent the most time with him, I have to say he couldn't remember things. He couldn't even remember me. We spent an hour together in 2021 in May, and then a few months later, I went back to the White House. I went back to Trump Tower to talk to him about his time in the White House, and he had this vacant look on his face, and I said, "Do you remember me?" And he said, "No." He had no recollection of our lengthy interview that we had, and he wasn't doing a lot of interviews at that time.
Not good. Not good. Again, taken together based on the standard that they try to impose on us and President Biden on Democrats in general about mental fitness, Donald Trump can't meet that standard. We have to stop rating him on a curve. Or Trump himself should stop trying to throw stones in glass houses. A couple more clips to show you, but on that score, an MSNBC analyst has that advice for Trump. Like, hey, given your recent gaffes, maybe you should be very careful when you try to cast aspersions about cognitive and mental fitness.
I'm not the one to determine who is having cognitive disabilities or not. At the same time, I usually don't throw a rock at a glass house when you, while making that very assertion, are messing things up yourself. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did this weekend when he was referring to his doctor in the White House and referred to him by the wrong name. Take a listen.
And of course, that's a reference to Ronnie Jackson, President Obama's former physician, a guy who's a Republican congressman now, and this guy is nuts, right? He has gone off the deep end. He used to work for President Obama, and they were apparently fairly close. But ever since he became a MAGA Republican, he is bending reality to try to accommodate Trump. He thinks that Donald Trump is the embodiment of physical fitness, and he has said as much, and he thinks that Donald Trump is in his prime. And yet for all of his services to Trump, Trump can't remember his last name at all. And again, we've talked about this, like it's okay to screw up a name, but not according to Fox and not according to MAGA and not according to the right. If Biden screws up a name and corrects himself or doesn't, Trump didn't correct himself after the Ronnie Johnson, because that's what he called him, Ronnie Johnson. You all see Ronnie Johnson there? It's Ronnie Jackson. But when Biden does something like that, it is a sign that Biden should be nowhere near the Oval Office. He is too unfit to be president. Trump does it, and he's given a pass by 50% of the country. We have to break that. And again, but to Von Hilliard's point, if Trump is going to be talking about these things, he should either be perfect, right? Or you shouldn't be casting aspersions like this when you commit the same sin, right? Don't throw stones in your glass house. But the other interesting thing, the last clip I want to play, is a CNN analyst, kind of in a roundabout way. He doesn't actually say CNN, but he does, make a pretty broad claim against the mainstream media, which I think is fully justified. And it includes CNN in my estimation, that there is a double standard here. And I love it when reporters and journalists, including Caitlin Collins, who I really like, are reminded of that, hey, it seems like everyone, wink, wink, including you, seem to grade Trump on a curve here, and maybe we should stop doing that.
But this moment with Donald Trump over the weekend where he was talking about the White House doctor, the former White House doctor who was there when Biden was actually vice president, and said this about him.
I think you should take a cognitive test like I did. I took a cognitive test and I aced it. Doc Ronnie Johnson. Does everyone know Ronnie Johnson, congressman from Texas? He was the White House doctor. And he said I was the healthiest president he feels in history. So I liked him very much.
I mean, his name is obviously Dr. Ronnie Jackson. Everyone remembers him from the White House briefings. He's now in Congress and a big supporter of Trump's. But a moment like that, is not treated the same as a Biden moment.
Of course not. That's never going to play on Fox News as Donald Trump being confused, having cognitive issues. It's just not going to be portrayed like that. And I think what the Biden folks take issue with as well is, in their eyes, the mainstream media as well focuses way too much on Biden's age and lets Donald Trump get off with these gaffes without ever questioning his cognitive fitness. There was that Wall Street Journal story that came out a week ago or 2 weeks ago where that questioned whether Biden was fit mentally to run the country, and said that some of these, there have been questions about this, but there have been a lot of former Trump officials who have raised the same issues with Trump, and it doesn't get treated the same way.
Oliver Darcy.
And it should. Thank God for this guy, because he's not just calling out the double standard in terms of how the gaffes are covered and presented, but also the fact that former Trump officials have come out and said the guy being Trump, is an idiot, he's ignorant, he's deranged, he's a combination of things. You don't hear that from former Biden officials or Obama officials about President Biden. That should say something. These people who worked for Trump, who have a vested political interest in Trump's party succeeded, who wanted him to succeed, which is why they worked for him and served him in the first place, are saying, do not vote for this guy. He's an idiot. He's a moron. He's ignorant. He's narcissistic. He's deranged. Imagine a counterfactual in which Biden supporters said that about Biden. It would get nonstop coverage, not just from right-wing media, but from mainstream media. Folks, why can't we hold these guys to the same standard? It's because Republicans, of course, have a vested interest in Trump being graded on a curve. And I think much of the mainstream media and so-called centrists and independents are terrified at the prospect that if you evaluate these two candidates by the same standards, that one of them is just clearly better than the other. I talked with Don Lemon about this, and he signaled kind of the same thing, that there's this false balance, this false equivalence that has to be created. But the false balance is where, there's so much substantively here about Donald Trump that we talk about his corruption, his narcissism, his criminal liabilities. We have to balance that with something from Biden. Biden's a gaffe machine. Biden's mentally unfit. Well, if Trump also has those issues by that same standard, why don't you talk about that? But it would tip the scales again. Facts tip the scales in favor of Democrats. It shatters the illusion that both sides are the same or comparable. And much of the mainstream media and much of so-called centrists and independents, they can't tolerate that. They have to do what they can. You have to grade one on a curve, whichever it is, and it's usually Republicans, in order to create this false balance. Trump's a criminal, but Biden's senile. Well, again, by that standard, Trump is a senile criminal. But that tips the scales. They can't have it. So we have to constantly talk about this. Listen, again, if you want to examine mental fitness, so be it, but hold them both to the same standard. And if you do that, the conclusion is inevitable, that whatever concerns you may have about President Biden and the Democrats, they're just objectively more competent at running a government than MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump. Let me know what you think in the comments.